1898, the year the world changed forever. Spain's 400-year empire crumbled, and from its ashes, America rose. This is the untold story of how one war ended an era and began another. 1898, the year the world changed forever. Spain's 400-year empire crumbled, and from its ashes, America rose. This is the untold story of how one war ended an era and began another. The Spanish-American War was more than a conflict over colonies. It was the turning point that redefined global power. For centuries, Spain had ruled vast territories with unmatched influence, stretching from the golden coasts of California to the islands of the Pacific. Its galleons once carried the wealth of continents. Its flag waved over oceans that seemed endless. But time is a silent conqueror. By the end of the 19th century, Spain's empire was fading, weakened by revolution, corruption, and the weight of history itself. Across the Atlantic, a young nation watched closely. A nation driven by ambition, restless energy, and the belief that its destiny was to shape the future of the world. That nation was the United States. The seeds of conflict began not on battlefields but in headlines and whispers. Cuba, one of Spain's last great colonies, was burning with rebellion. The Cuban people longed for freedom, and the American press told their story with passion and fire. Each newspaper headline fanned the flames of outrage, and soon the cry for intervention echoed through American streets. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, it became the spark that lit the fire of war. The truth of the explosion remains debated to this day, but its impact was undeniable. The United States declared war, and the world watched as a new power prepared to test its strength against an empire that had ruled for centuries. The battles that followed were swift and decisive. In the Philippines, American forces led by Commodore George Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay within hours. Half a world away, in Cuba, American troops fought under blistering heat and deadly disease. Among them was a young Theodore Roosevelt, leading his Rough Riders up the hills of Santiago in one of the most iconic moments of the war. It was not just a clash of armies, but a clash of eras, the industrial might of a new republic confronting the worn grandeur of a fading monarchy. When the smoke cleared, the result was clear. Spain's empire had fallen. Its once mighty territories were gone. Cuba was granted its independence, while the United States gained Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The world's balance of power had shifted forever. For Spain, it was the end of 4 centuries of global dominance. For the United States, it was the beginning of an age of expansion, confidence, and global ambition. The war lasted only a few months, but its consequences shaped the next 100 years. The victory gave America not just territory, but identity. It marked the nation's first step onto the world stage as a major power. Factories roared, ships sailed under the stars and stripes to new oceans, and a new sense of destiny filled the American spirit. Yet behind that triumph, questions lingered. What did it mean to be a power? Could liberty and imperialism coexist? The nation that once fought against empire now held one of its own. The United States had not only defeated Spain, it had inherited the moral weight of empire itself. Across the Atlantic, Spain faced its own reckoning. The loss shattered national pride and forced a generation to reflect on what had gone wrong. Intellectuals, artists, and reformers began to ask how a nation that once ruled half the world could fall so far. From that pain, a cultural awakening emerged, the Generation of '98. Thinkers who sought to rebuild Spain not through conquest, but through knowledge, art, and renewal. Their writings, filled with sorrow and wisdom, reminded the world that even in defeat, a nation's soul can endure. For both nations, 1898 was more than a year of war. It was the moment they were reborn in different ways. the United States stepped into the 20th century with power and purpose, while Spain turned. Spain's legacy in the Americas began long before the United States even existed. When Spanish explorers crossed the Atlantic in the late 15th century, they carried with them not only weapons and ships, but an unshakable belief that they were chosen to expand civilization to new worlds. Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492 under the flag of Spain was the beginning of an empire unlike any the world had ever seen. Spain claimed vast territories, from Mexico and the Caribbean to South America and the western edges of what would one day become the United States. Their empire brought gold, silver, and power beyond imagination, but it also brought conquest, conflict, and transformation. Entire cultures were reshaped, languages evolved, and faiths collided, giving birth to a new world of blended identity. The Spanish influence dug deep into the soil of the Americas, in their architecture, in their language, and in the very names of the lands they once ruled. While Spain built cathedrals and cities across the New World, another story was quietly unfolding in the English colonies to the north. The seeds of a new nation were being planted, one that would later grow into the United States of America. For centuries, these two worlds existed side by side, one built on monarchy and Catholic faith, the other born from revolution and a belief in liberty. Their paths rarely crossed directly, but their destinies were connected through geography, ambition, and time. As Spain's empire aged, the United States grew restless and bold. The ideals of manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to expand from coast to coast, began to shape its national vision. While Spain's influence remained strong in Latin America, the U.S. began looking south and west, seeing opportunity in every open horizon. By the 1800s, the balance of power in the Americas began to shift. One by one, Spain's colonies fought for their independence. Mexico, Argentina, Chile, and others rose against imperial rule. The fires of revolution spread, inspired in part by the very principles that gave birth to the United States. Spain's control slipped away like sand through fingers, and with each loss, its once vast empire shrank. The United States, meanwhile, grew in strength and confidence, pushing westward, building industries, and asserting its voice in world affairs. The two nations represented opposite ends of history's spectrum, one clinging to the past, the other charging into the future. Yet, despite their differences, they shared a deep and lasting connection through the lands and cultures they both touched. Spanish culture left an imprint so deep that even as the U.S. expanded, it could not erase what Spain had built. Cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Antonio, and Santa Fe bear Spanish names that echo the empire's reach. Spanish missions became landmarks, their bell towers still standing as silent witnesses to centuries of change. The language of Spain blended with the language of America, creating a cultural fusion that defines much of the U.S. Southwest today. Food, music, and traditions rooted in Spanish heritage became part of the American fabric, proving that history never truly disappears. It transforms. In diplomacy and politics, the two nations began to move from rivals to partners. The 19th and 20th centuries saw alliances form where conflict once reigned. Trade replaced warships, and dialogue replaced gunfire. American writers, artists, and travelers found inspiration in Spain's beauty, while Spanish thinkers studied the rapid progress of the United States. It was a relationship no longer built on conquest, but on understanding, the meeting of old wisdom and new ambition. Through centuries of change, Spain and the United States have reflected each other in unexpected ways. One represents the golden age of exploration, the other, the modern age of innovation. Both nations have known victory and loss, power and humility. Together, when we look at the long arc of history between the United States and Spain, we see more than battles and treaties. We see the reflection of two worlds destined to shape each other's identity. One, an ancient empire born from monarchy, exploration, and faith. The other, a young republic born from revolution, freedom, and ambition. The story of their relationship is a mirror of humanity's endless pursuit of power, discovery, and meaning. Spain entered history as one of the most formidable forces on Earth, its explorers sailing across uncharted oceans, mapping continents, and building cities where none had stood before. The Spanish Empire stretched from Europe to the farthest edges of the Americas, its language and faith spreading like waves upon every shore. Yet, as history always reminds us, even the strongest empires fade when time demands change. By the 18th century, Spain's golden age had dimmed, while new nations began to rise, hungry for progress and control. Across the Atlantic, the United States emerged with a revolutionary spirit, rejecting the rule of kings and declaring that liberty belonged to the people. It was a nation defined not by old traditions, but by new dreams. As America expanded westward, it came closer to territories once claimed by Spain, lands rich in history, culture, and influence. The shadows of Spanish missions and fortresses still lay across the deserts and coastlines, silent witnesses to centuries of exploration. Though the Spanish flag no longer flew over those lands, its legacy could be felt in every town, every border, every name. The two nations were tied together by geography and fate, even when they stood on opposite sides of the world's changing order. By the 19th century, the contrast between the two had become symbolic of a larger transformation. Spain represented the old order, proud, regal, yet burdened by the weight of centuries. The United States represented the new, restless, ambitious, and driven by the belief that destiny was its own to shape. When their paths collided in 1898, it was not simply a war of armies. It was a clash between eras. The Spanish-American War was a moment when history turned its page, and the power that had once defined the world gave way to a rising force that would define the century ahead. Spain's defeat marked the end of an empire, but also the beginning of renewal. The United States emerged victorious, but also faced questions about its role as a new imperial power. What began as a battle for freedom in Cuba became the foundation of America's global reach. Yet even as the tides of empire shifted, respect grew between the two nations. The United States looked to Spain's past with fascination, its art, its culture, its resilience, while Spain studied America's rise with both caution and admiration. The 20th century brought them closer through shared challenges: world wars, diplomacy, and cultural exchange. American students studied Spanish language and history, while Spanish thinkers visited America's universities and cities, witnessing the rhythm of a society built on innovation. Their relationship evolved from competition to cooperation, from conquest to connection. It became a dialogue between history and progress, between the old world and the new. Today, the influence of both nations flows freely across borders. The United States carries within it traces of Spain's legacy, in its cities, in its language, in its spirit of exploration. Spain, in turn, has embraced modernity, innovation, and democracy, moving forward while honoring its past. Together, they symbolize how nations can grow beyond rivalry and find strength in shared history. The story of Spain and the United States is not one of enemies, but of evolution. Two nations that began worlds apart, yet found common ground in the pursuit of identity, power, and purpose. It is a reminder that history is not a straight line, but a circle, where the lessons of one era become the foundation. Every empire rises under the promise of glory, and every nation believes its power will last forever, yet history has never spared even the greatest. Spain once stood as the beating heart of global dominance, its ships commanding the oceans, its language echoing across continents, and its faith shaping civilizations. The phrase, "the empire on which the sun never sets," was not a metaphor, but a reality. For wherever daylight touched, there too were Spanish lands. Across the seas, cathedrals were built, gold was mined, and cities were founded in the name of kings and faith. Spain's story was one of courage and conquest, of explorers who sailed into the unknown and changed the map of the world. But no empire, no matter how vast, can resist the quiet erosion of time. Centuries passed, and the power that once flowed through Madrid began to fade. Wars, revolutions, and the shifting tides of modernity weakened the old empire. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a new force was gathering its strength. A nation born from rebellion and built upon ideals of liberty and opportunity. The United States entered the 19th century as a young but determined nation, its people driven by innovation, confidence, and an unshakable belief in progress. While Spain held on to its final colonies, the United States expanded westward, stretching from coast to coast. The dream of manifest destiny burned bright, the idea that America was destined to expand its influence and reshape the world. Spain, once the master of the New World, now watched as the balance of power began to shift. When the two nations finally collided in the Spanish-American War of 1898, it was more than a military conflict. It was a symbolic handover of global leadership. The old empire, weary and fractured, met the energy of a rising republic ready to define a new century. The war itself was brief but decisive. In just a few months, Spain's centuries-long empire crumbled under the speed and force of modern warfare. Battles in Cuba and the Philippines ended not only with the defeat of Spain's fleets, but with the realization that a new world order had begun. The United States emerged as a global power, standing on the threshold of empire even as it declared itself a champion of freedom. Spain's loss was not merely territorial, it was the end of an age. The world that had once revolved around Spanish power now turned toward Washington and New York. Yet, in the quiet aftermath of war, both nations faced the same question. What comes after glory? For Spain, the fall sparked introspection and rebirth. The defeat of 1898 gave rise to a movement of writers and thinkers known as the Generation of 98, who looked deep into their nation's soul, searching for meaning beyond conquest. They wrote not of lost colonies, but of lost purpose, asking how a nation could find strength again in art, education, and culture. For the United States, victory brought pride, but also doubt. The country that had fought for independence now held territories thousands of miles away, from the Caribbean to the Pacific. The ideals of freedom and empire stood side by side, uneasy companions on the path to modern power. Over time, the relationship between Spain and the United States evolved from conflict to cooperation. The two nations found common ground in trade, diplomacy, and shared values. Spanish culture continued to influence the American way of life, in architecture, language, cuisine, and faith, leaving marks that endure to this day. American travelers and writers found inspiration in Spain's landscapes and traditions, while Spanish artists and thinkers admired America's energy and innovation. History, once written in rivalry, became a bridge connecting two worlds. As the 20th century unfolded, Spain and the United States stood together through moments of global challenge. From the shadows of war to the dawn of peace, their relationship reflected the transformation of both nations, from empires of conquest. The history of the United States and Spain is not simply a tale of war and power. It is the journey of two civilizations that shaped one another across centuries. From the first Spanish explorers who charted the unknown to the rise of America as a new global force, their stories intertwine like waves meeting on distant shores. Spain gave the New World its language, its faith, and its cultural soul. The United States carried forward the spirit of innovation, freedom, and ambition that defined the modern age. One empire faded as another emerged, but both left indelible marks upon humanity's story. In the end, It was not conquest that defined their legacy, but transformation. Spain taught the world how empires rise. America showed how nations reinvent themselves. Together, they proved that history does not belong to those who conquer, but to those who endure, learn, and evolve. The bridges between these two nations, built through culture, art, language, and resilience, remind us that no power lasts forever, but every civilization leaves a light behind. And in that light, the names of Spain and the United States will forever stand as symbols of the past that created our present, and the present that continues to shape our future.